And just before we get started, we have two announcements. I think Helen Alexander has an announcement, and then Theo will have one as she introduces Zak.
All right.
Go ahead, Helen.
So quick introduction. Ben was just wanting rain. I don't want rain because we are still trying to finally do a burn out at the Free State Prairie Restoration, hopefully on Monday. It's not going to be a good burn, but we want to try to cut the brush back. So if by any chance anybody wants to help out, email me at halexander@ku.edu and tell me your cell phone number, and I will keep you posted.
Excellent. H. Alexander, I thought you were Halex.
I'm both. So Halex, I have more than one.
You have lots of, okay.
They all go the same place.
Great. So just a quick reminder that the formal seminar we're recording, it's going to be posted on the KBS website. We're going to mute participants during the formal seminar. And if anybody else has any announcements or there's questions that come up, just send us a message through the chat and we'll be happy to call on you, or the speaker can at the end of the formal seminar after we stop recording. So with that, I will hand it off to Theo for the introduction.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks for being here today. And it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Zak Ratajczak. Zak works to better understand how plant communities respond to changing climate and land management, with an emphasis on fire and native megafauna. He got his PhD in biology from K-State, and after his postdoc experiences, he has returned to K-State, where he is now an assistant professor. Zak is particularly interested in the idea of resilience and uses a variety of tools to explore these interests, including ground-based measurements, remote sensing, and computer simulations. And this is one of the many reasons I wanted to invite Zak to share his research with the KBS community. I think he takes a creative and dynamic approach to exploring this idea of resilience and really grounds what can be this abstract concept in the data, and therefore making resilience really tangible and informative. And then I just wanted to mention that Zak is interested in meeting with us to talk about research, which I think is really great. And so I'm organizing meetings for April 22nd. And if you're interested, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be, like I said, organizing that. And I will have Ben put my KU email in the chat. So thanks, everyone, and welcome, Zak.
Thanks, Theo. That's a very kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this. It's kind of extra exciting to give a talk to people that live in a really similar region. And the reason that's extra exciting right now is everything I'm going to present today is kind of at the writing up stage. So we're still looking for feedback and where we should poke holes in this. And so it's, I think, a perfect stage for a group like this at KU. So thank you for the introduction. With that, I will just jump into it, but not before acknowledging the people that have helped make this work possible. So I'm going to talk to you pretty much about two siloed research questions today related to bison. So for the first research question, I really need to acknowledge the co-authors, who are basically most of the people that have worked on grazing in some form or another at Kanza Prairie, LTR, and Biological Station. For the second question, I really need to acknowledge my lab. I'm in my second year at K-State, and the graduate students in my lab have contributed quite a bit to this project over the last summer and through this school year. And finally, the funding for this comes from the many cycles of NSF funding to keep Kanza going as an LTR station, the many PIs and volunteers that keep our site funded and our experimental treatments maintained. And then for data, we have a pretty important data acknowledgement, in that the second question that I'm going to talk about here would not be possible without federal data initiatives, particularly NSF's NEON and USDA's NAPE data of aerial imagery. So thanks to all these important people. So when I try and describe my interests, the term we've kind of come up with, as we think of it, as applied theoretical ecology. In terms of my academic interests, I'm really interested in theoretical ecology within the field of community ecology. But what we try and do is, when we address theoretical questions, we try to do them in systems that have some kind of conservation threat, so that while we're potentially advancing our theory, we're also developing insights that can have conservation impacts. So if we're thinking about the theory, one of the areas that's just fascinated me for a long time is the potential for ecosystems to have thresholds or tipping points where eventually they're exposed to pressures that exceed their resilience, and afterwards they show very little ability to repair themselves. So just like a toy example of this could be a system state shown by this black line that's getting exposed to different disturbances or pulse stressors over time. And in this first panel, we see reoccurring recovery. We pulse the system, it's altered, but it bounces back afterwards. And we have this reoccurring pattern of pulse or disturbance followed by recovery. In the second toy example here, we have our disturbance or our stressor increasing in intensity over time. So with each one of these disturbances or stresses, you see a greater dip in the ecosystem state. And then something happens when we hit this threshold of disturbance intensity and the system fails to recover afterwards. You can often do the same thing by also exposing systems to more frequent disturbances as well, which is what I'm showing you in this third panel here. So that's one toy example of where systems exceed their resilience because of changes in external drivers. Another kind of fascinating area in this portion of theoretical ecology is why two ecosystems could be exposed to the same set of stressors or disturbances and show very different resilience over time. So I'm just stealing the system state from panel 2 up here, where we have a system disturbed, and on the third disturbance, you see lack of recovery. So it's not showing resilience, the ability to bounce back anymore. Whereas the second ecosystem, let's pretend it's located nearby, is exposed to the same set of stresses or disturbances, and is able to, be resilient to these stresses and disturbances and bounces back after. So throughout this talk, you'll hear me use the word resilience and tipping point now and then. I'll unpack the word tipping point later, but for my work, I use the kind of Brian Walker definition of resilience, which is the ability to tolerate changing disturbances, stresses, and other drivers without undergoing some qualitative change to a new state that is pretty much unrecognizable compared to a more historical baseline. So in these examples here, ecosystem 1 has exceeded its resilience and undergone that qualitative shift. And so this is an area that's interested ecologists for quite a while. It was first formalized by Lewontin in the late 60s, and in particular C.S. Holling in the early 70s. Robert May took to task mathematical models to show how these ideas are possible. And you can just kind of see that throughout time, an interest in resilience and tipping points has been sustained. And I would also argue we're finally getting to the point where we have enough data that we can actually quantify these processes more than we've been able to in the past, especially in places like tallgrass prairie, which are a little slower to respond to changes in disturbance. So that's the theoretical part. The applied part is that I do most of my work in tallgrass prairie, which is one of the most threatened ecosystems in North America. Most estimates are that it's at about 4% of its historical extent, primarily due to historical conversion to row crop agriculture. So both of us, you and Lawrence and me here, are located approximately where the star is, which is the western kind of ecotone of where tallgrass prairie was before European expansion across the plains. It houses a mix of generalists as well as grassland endemics like prairie dogs and lesser prairie chickens, some of which are threatened today, and many species that aren't threatened are still in some form of steep decline. Historically, within the prairie we have left, some definitive features were the presence of native grazers, which I'm going to unpack a lot today, a variable climate, which would include extreme droughts every 50 to 100 years, and intermittent fires. We don't always know the exact fire frequency, but a lot of estimates put it at 2 to 4 years, maybe ranging from 2 to 10 years, through a combination of lightning strikes and intentional lighting of fires by Native Americans. Since then, though, we've seen some really big changes in what kind of the defining factors in this system. So the plains bison, which are in this video over here, we're largely used to number in the millions in the Great Plains and tallgrass prairie, but we're reduced to about 600 individuals. Today, we think there's approximately 300,000 bison, of which 3,000 to 5,000 are found in the state of Kansas. No matter how you look at it, it's about a 99% decline in this population. So while we do have bison in some locations, this iconic megafauna, it has been greatly reduced at the landscape scale. I should mention, though, in a lot of places it has been replaced by cattle. So we're going to talk a bit today about how replacing these animals with cattle potentially does or doesn't alter these plant communities I'm interested in. Fire has changed quite a bit as well in the Great Plains. So, we think the average burn return was 3 to 4 years. Using satellites, we now find that about 50% of Flint Hills tallgrass prairie is burned every year. About 10% is burned every 2 years. About 25% is burned every 4 to 10 years. And then 33% is burned less often. So if you add up that every 2 years or that every 3 to 4 years, you're seeing that very little of the Central Plains is now burned at that frequency before Europeans arrived. So I want to take a moment to just talk about mega grazers, native megafauna, and do so in context of the more broad idea of keystone species, because as we'll talk about, megafauna are purported keystone species. So if you think about keystone species more generally, these are species that if we were to put them in something like a network here and are shown in red, they have really strong connectivity to other species in the ecosystem. So if each one of these nodes is another species, you might have an example here where this megafauna has a lot of connections to other components in the systems. You might also find that they're what's called a routing node, or where they connect to important nodes of species. All this is just a kind of theoretical way to say that, like many keystone species, megafauna potentially have a large impact on ecosystems, even if they aren't especially abundant. And so I like this diagram by Galletti et al., just showing this potential network of interactions that native megafauna, so really large animals, often herbivores, had with the other species and processes in the ecosystems in which they occurred. Because they're large animals, by definition, they're going to consume a large amount of biomass. They're also going to potentially be the host to many things like parasites or predators. And so you can imagine that these species have a numerous number of connections to other species within the ecosystems they used to inhabit. And so what I want to talk about today is what happens when you have this incredibly important, well, purportedly important species, and you just completely remove it. That means all these connections potentially disappear. And so how does an ecosystem reorganize after it loses such a large and influential species? So zooming back into tallgrass prairie, it's thought that bison were what we call a keystone species. So again, they don't have to be super abundant, but they can have a large impact on the overall community. This is a diagram by Scott Collins kind of summarizing this idea. Within our system, one of the major components of the plant community is dominant C4 grasses. So left to their own devices, so if they're burned pretty often, they have the right climate conditions, a handful of C4 grass species in our tallgrass prairie plant communities can become very abundant and have a really negative effect on other species like forbs or subdominant grasses. What this does is that the overall community can have a very low diversity if grasses are allowed to become very abundant. What Scott is showing here, though, is that if we have grazing, potentially by bison, potentially by cattle, these grazers overwhelmingly consume dominant C4 grasses. So their presence can potentially reduce the abundance of C4 grasses. And then this has the indirect interaction of potentially increasing the diversity of all these other species. So the presence of this grazer could have a major impact on diversity. This is nicely shown by a meta-analysis over here by Sally Kerner, where the effect of grazers on overall a measurement of species dominance, so how overabundant are a few dominant species, is closely related to changes in the species richness in areas with and without herbivores. So in these areas right here, where herbivores have greatly reduced the dominance of key species, the y-axis here shows increases in diversity in grazed versus ungrazed areas. And what we see is that when grazers reduce overdominance of grasses or other species, they tend to increase diversity of the rest of the plant community. So this is all great. Maybe we can reintroduce megafauna or large grazers to these communities and increase their plant diversity. But even if that happens, we know there's another challenge waiting out there, and that's the potential threat of climate change. The graph below is an ensemble of GCMs for the coming century by Cook et al. And the graph here shows you the potential occurrence of decade-long droughts, so a drought that would last about 10 years under different measurements of measuring drought intensity. The graph I'm showing you here is under RCP 4.5, so that's when we greatly reduce carbon emissions. And what you see is that we have enough potential warming in this region baked in for the Central Plains that we could potentially expect an 80 to 90% risk of a decade-long drought by mid-century here in the Great Plains. So even if we can increase the diversity of these systems, it's going to have to be resilient to these extreme droughts if it's going to actually persist and have a positive impact on plant diversity. And I probably don't need to remind this, that the last time we had one of these long droughts, mega drought associated with the Dust Bowl, that drought did not last 10 years, thankfully, but it did last 4 to 5 and had major impacts. Although it's also worth noting that there is really great work by Jim Weaver and colleagues that shows a lot of grasslands did bounce back or were resilient to this mega drought in the 1940s. All right, so let's push all that together into a couple simple questions for the rest of this talk. In general, we're going to be talking about how does the removal or replacement of native megagrazers, bison, plains bison, impact grassland diversity and its resilience to pressures like changes in fire and climate. So first, we're going to use a long-term data set and experiment to look at plant community diversity, where we've reintroduced bison, we've left some areas ungrazed, and then we have domestic cattle, and track how plant diversity changes over time. And due to a natural experiment of sorts, we're going to also get some measure of its resilience to climate extremes. So that'll be our first question. And then our second question is going to be how these grazers impact the relationship between vegetation and fire at our study site. So first, just a little bit more background on tallgrass prairie, our study site. Again, it is dominated by these potentially abundant C4 grasses. 4 species alone of these dominant C4 grasses can make up 90% of net primary productivity as long as you're burning really often and don't have grazers present. It does have a documented potential for high floristic diversity from subdominant forms, grasses, and sedges if grass abundance isn't especially high. It's a very clonal system. So on average, if you go out to a chunk of tallgrass prairie, at least at our study site, and were to track each stem, if it came from a seed or if it's a clone, a meristem, in general, over 99% of stems are going to be from these clones. And finally, the dominant grasses can produce very, very substantial forage for grazers. It's a very productive system that can maintain pretty high abundances and body weights of large grazers like bison and cattle. So for this first question, our specific hypotheses are that bison reintroduction will increase plant diversity. What we weren't sure of when we started this set of analyses, though, is what the overall magnitude would be. So how much will it increase diversity given enough time? And how fast can it increase diversity? Does it have an initial time lag, or does reintroducing these animals actually have immediate impacts? Fortunately, we're going to be able to compare them directly to domestic cattle as they're managed in our landscape. And our kind of a priori hypothesis is that cattle will probably increase diversity because they also primarily consume dominant C4 grasses, but perhaps they won't increase diversity quite as much because they haven't co-evolved with this plant community. Finally, one of our hypotheses is that some of these biodiversity gains are going to prove resilient to climate extremes. And the kind of rationale behind that is that in general, more diverse grasslands have been shown to be more resistant to climate extremes. Also, the forbs that become more abundant in the presence of bison tend to have these deep roots that tap into more perennial water sources, which might allow them to withstand one of these extreme droughts. So all the work I'm going to show you today is from Konza Prairie LTR. It's a factorial, large-scale experiment manipulating fire. So we have areas burned every 1 year, every 2 years, about every 3.5 years, and about every 20 years. And that's factorially crossed with the presence of plains bison since 1991, cattle in some locations since 1991, and areas that have not been grazed since 1982. To give you an idea of kind of the scale of this experiment, I have a black line showing you along this photograph. This portion in the middle is a 1 year area that is not grazed, adjacent to a 3.5 year burn to the right, also in the absence of grazers. So these treatments that are a fairly large scale. Each one of these kind of replicates of fire and grazing is at least 44 hectares, but many are much larger. If you don't think in hectares, 44 hectares is approximately 82 American football fields. So we're going to focus this analysis I'm going to show you on long-term changes over time, so time series analysis. It's going to be areas burned every 1 and every 3 to 4 years, because that's closer to our historical fire regime. It's going to be upland locations, because that's the only area we have data from bison, cattle, and ungrazed area. We're gonna have 4 treatments, and we're gonna have our ungrazed location. We're gonna have areas that have been grazed by bison since 1991. We're gonna have cattle treatment 1, which is the most analogous treatment to our bison treatment. It's also been grazed by cattle since 1991. And then we're gonna have cattle treatment 2, which I'm not gonna focus on as much because it's only been grazed since 2010. And it's on a somewhat different soil type than the other locations that I'm gonna show you. So our main focus today is gonna be this ungrazed bison and cattle treatment 1. I don't wanna dwell on this, but the analyses I'm showing you are based on our long-term monitoring plots. So for each of these combinations of treatments, we have 80 plots total, and it's multi-scalar. So we start at the plot scale, which is 10 meters squared. Plots are along transects, 50-meter long transects. We have 4 transects for each of our fire by grazing combos. And then we have yet 4 more of these catchments in each landscape. Today, I'm just going to show you the landscape scale. So all our plots together and the plot scale. So when we drill down to a small area, how do these animals affect plant diversity over time? So when we're at the plot scale, we're at 10 meters squared. When we're at the landscape scale, it's going to be 80 plots considered together over a pretty large area. All right, so I'm going to take a moment to unpack these figures because they are a little noisy. In each of these figures, the gray bar here will denote when we reintroduce our mega grazers, whether it's bison or cattle, at least for bison and cattle treatment 1. And what we're doing is we're fitting a time series up to the data until 2010 for most of our response variables. And as I'll show you in a second, we're going to then use that same model and project it forward for the rest of the data. And the reason is we have a climate extreme that occurs in 2011 and 2012, and we're interested in whether or not this climate extreme essentially dislodges trends in time from what we expected before the climate extreme occurred. So that's the anatomy of these figures I'm going to show you with different colors and point types denoting our treatments. In this example, we're showing grass cover. So kind of like we expect, if you don't have bison or cattle around, grass cover remains relatively high and actually shows some increase over time up till 2010. And as soon as we reintroduce bison, we see that grass cover is going down up till 2010, and we can project that statistical relationship forward through the climate extreme. So just quickly, a little bit of notice on this climate extreme itself. I forgot to look up if Lawrence was similarly affected by this climate extreme in 2011 and 2012, but in Manhattan, Kansas, at least an hour down the road, 2011 and 2012 were miserable. We had some of our lowest rainfall. So these dashed lines I'm showing you are the 5th and 95th percentile from 1981 to 2020. And what you see is that in 2012 in particular, rainfall was the 2nd lowest we've ever measured on site, well below the 5th percentile. 2011 was also fairly dry, although not quite as dry as 2012. And then both years were incredibly warm. So 2011 was nearly above the 95th percentile, and then 2012 was way above the 25th percentile. If you put those things together, what you find is that these 2 years together, especially if you consider them as a 2-year running average, are among the strongest combination of being very hot and having very low rainfall as well. So 2011 and 2012, we're going to treat as our climate extreme as a way to potentially gauge resilience of plant communities to climate extremes. So that's why I have this climate extreme bar in here for you as well. If it helps you remember, we switched from a solid line up through 2010 because we've actually fit the statistical model there. And we switched to a dashed line because we're projecting that relationship forward through the data without actually considering it in the line fit after 2010. And we've done this trick where to try and compare this statistically, we compare the residuals from these line fits before and after the climate extreme as our statistical test of whether or not changes in any given state variable keep pace with what we expected before the climate extreme or start to go above or below that linear relationship. So I'm going to show you species richness first. So that's just going to be the total number of species we find in all our plots, the number of unique species. And I should note these are native species only. So we're not including invasive species here. For the landscape scale, some of our data doesn't come online until 1994. So that's why I'm showing you starting in 1994. And what you can see is that there's this pretty nice linear increase in species richness in the presence of bison up through 2010. We go from if you were down here, probably about 80 species to about 115 species by 2010. In contrast, area without bison have a pretty flat change over time and maintain much lower species richness. Areas with cattle sort of fall in between by 2010. I forgot to mention, unfortunately, we don't start getting data from our cattle units until 2008. So I'm only going to show you cattle data from 2008 onwards, and that didn't give us enough data to fit a trend before this climate extreme. So we're going to have to be kind of qualitative when we think about the cattle treatment and climate extremes. But the overall takeaway here, bison have greatly increased species richness, much more so than cattle, and the areas without bison still show fairly low richness. Interesting stuff starts to happen during the climate extreme. So when we have the climate extreme affecting all these units equally, the species richness within the bison area decreases substantially. But what's interesting, to me at least, especially someone interested in tipping points and resilience, is that it seems to recover basically to the projected increase in species richness almost a year afterwards. So we go a year after the climate extreme, and we now find the species richness within our plots is right back where we would expect it to be. And moving through the rest of the data through 2019, excuse me, it's more or less tracking the linear increase we had projected. In fact, we don't have enough data, but on average, it's a little bit above. Ungrazed areas, again, appear to be mostly flat. The cattle treatment 1, which is our most analogous comparison, seems to show some kind of decrease, maybe a little bit of recovery, but kind of maintains its overall pattern of being in between a bison and cattle graze location. This cattle treatment 2, where cattle had just been reintroduced, actually shows an increase after the climate extreme, but overall richness does remain below areas with bison. So that was the landscape scale. That's all 800 meters squared of sampling area. Let's just look quickly at a fine scale, because a lot of tallgrass prairie remains in really small patches of prairie. So we're also interested in how does richness change at fine scales. In this plot, the markers for each treatment are going to show you the average species richness across all these plots. And the ribbons here, the shaded area, is showing you the 25th to the 75th percentile. So the bottom's the 25th, the top is the 75th. The pattern here is really similar. Richness increases in the presence of bison fairly linearly up until this climate extreme. We see a dip during the climate extreme. It takes a little bit longer for average species richness to recover, but approximately 2 years afterwards, that recovery has occurred. And in fact, if we compare the residuals before and after the climate extreme, they're analogous. So they're both more or less show a zero tendency. Areas without any form of grazer have again been relatively flat. So that's shown in the blue here. And then these areas with cattle, this part is kind of cool. Well, not from a conservation perspective. Cattle treatment 1 had been maintaining somewhat similar species richness as the bison area, but we actually do see a bit of a dip in species richness afterwards, even though species richness continues to increase within the bison area. So let's just zoom out and look at this as in a more digestible table. This is the percent increases in species richness in our 3 grazer treatments at different scales relative to the ungrazed treatment. So if we look at the landscape scale, so far, as of 2018, bison have increased species richness 52% compared to an ungrazed location. At the transect scale, so 5 plots, they've increased species richness 73%. At the plot scale, they've increased it 74%. Cattle have also tended to increase species richness, but to a lower degree. And I should just say these are ANOVAs with a post-hoc comparison. And that all these differences, if they show a shaded color, are significant at a p-value of less than 0.01. So overall, bison have increased diversity and at most scales more than cattle. So the last thing we did here is we took one of our co-authors' meta-analysis that I showed you earlier of how grazers, their presence and absence, have impacted plant species richness around the world. So Sally Kerner performed a meta-analysis where she found 252 studies with the presence absence of grazers and derived what we call the log ratio of species richness. So it's the log of grazed areas by ungrazed areas. And this means that more positive values indicate that grazers are increasing species richness more. And so the graph I'm showing you here is Sally's data set with the gray bars. So areas shaded in dark gray are the 55th to 75th percentile of Sally's global data set of grazers. The light gray here is showing you the 25th to the 95th of all her log response ratios. And then these dots show you where our data plot out as of 2018. And so what I hope pops out here is that the log response ratio for bison, except at the landscape scale, is well above the 95th percentile for increases in species richness due to the presence absence of a large grazer. In fact, in some cases, it's far above the log response ratio at a global scale. In contrast, our cattle treatments tend to fall much closer to the median for this global data set of 252 studies. For the plant community ecologists in the audience, I should mention we've looked at the sort of usual suspects and some less usual suspects for assessing plant species diversity. So Shannon index, we use the H index. We've looked at coefficients of conservatism, and in general, basically all of these same trends still hold. Increases in diversity that are fairly linear at most scales, especially for Shannon index. The results are very analogous with some resilience to this climate extreme and greater increases at smaller scales. All right, so what's not new here? Frankly, we've known for a while that in general, bison probably increase diversity in tallgrass prairie. And so Scott Collins and many other people have done this research at our site. There's analogous research down in Oklahoma that shows that in general, bison through consuming dominant grasses increase plant species diversity. And Scott has even shown too that it's at both scales. It's at the fine scale and it's at the landscape scale. So what's new here? A lot of Scott's work on grazers reported data for Kanza through about the early 2000s or the late 1990s. And so now with this extra 2 decades of data, we can have some more inference about how these animals are affecting plant communities. So first off, what I think is new here is that these gains in diversity due to reintroducing bison appear remarkably consistent. They fit a linear trend for 3 decades of experimental reintroduction of a large grazer. And so far, we see no signs of these increases plateauing. So we fully expect that eventually this can't continue forever. There's only so many species you can pack in, but 30 years in, we've not seen a plateauing of these increases in diversity. So far, the gains by reintroducing bison appear to be larger than domestic cattle. So although these animals are quite similar, bison are doing other things like wallowing or consuming in different spatial patterns that lead to greater increases in diversity. Frankly, we don't have a good mechanistic understanding of this at our site yet, why these animals differ so much. The gains we've recorded here so far are among some of the largest recorded globally due to the presence and absence of grazers. And at least if we consider a 2-year climate extreme, so far they're resilient. But we'll come back to this later. We know these droughts could get much worse. So, take that for what it's worth. All right, so let's do a little bit of a hard pivot because I don't want to go over time and talk about how grazers affect the relationship between fire and vegetation in tallgrass prairie. This is an illustration from Kanza Prairie. We're in a graze location here where the right-hand side has been burned every 2 years and the left-hand side has been burned every 20 years. And what should pop out is that the area that's been burned less often is now dominated by a combination of shrubs and trees, some of which are quite tall and make up a large area. So clearly burning less can result in the increase in woody vegetation in tallgrass prairie, which historically had very, very little woody vegetation except along rivers. Why this is potentially important from a conservation perspective is that these woody plants have a really large impact on higher trophic levels. This is a study from nearby in the Red Hills by Joe Lautenbach on lesser prairie chicken habitat usage compared to the abundance of trees. And so what Joe did is he tracked site preference of lesser prairie chickens and regressed that against the density of trees. And what Joe finds is that the probability of finding prairie chickens decreases precipitously once you reach rangeland that has 1 to 2 trees per hectare. A hectare is approximately 2 American football fields. So that means these prairie chickens basically do not use prairie once there's about 2 trees per football field. So a very little amount of woody vegetation, especially trees, can deter these animals. And some similar things have been shown for things like songbirds as well. So thankfully, through prescribed burning, though, we can maintain frequent fire. And if it's frequent enough, it can kill woody vegetation and potentially maintain these systems in a grassland state. So I'm going to kind of do this flipped. I'm going to show you the results of this study first and then walk you through our interpretation of them. I know that's a little less orthodox, but I think it's a little easier to follow. So we're going to use a combination of remote sensing and ground-based measurements to measure woody plant vegetation across different fire frequencies. So places burned every 1 year, every 2 years, and approximately every 3.5 years, and places with the presence and absence of bison. We're going to do a complementary field study as well, where we have 24 plots on the ground for each of these combinations as well. And I'll pull out the statistics as we go through each of these analyses. So we've been really lucky lately in that in addition to our ground-based approaches, Kanza is now a neon site, which means we get a flyover, a low elevation flyover of our site every year, every 2 years, that provides us with hyperspectral data at a 1 meter or finer resolution, as well as lidar data, which is starting to give us inference on the vertical structure of plant material. So it uses lasers and their return time to estimate the height of vegetation at a very fine resolution. And I'll show you a bit what that looks like here. So this is just a simple red, green, blue picture from the USDA NAEP, another approach using low flying aircraft. And this is what we would see if we go into Google Earth. You have an area burned every year, every 2 years, every 3.5, every 4 years. And if you zoomed around in Google Earth, you'd see basically the same thing. And we use this data as well in the analysis I'm about to show you. Through NAEP and through NEON, we also get many other spectra of light that our eyes can't see. So this is a false color image that includes the near infrared spectrum of light. So that spectrum of light that's a bit longer wavelength than our eyes can see and is closer to sensible heat. And then this LiDAR technology gives us vertical structure of our vegetation. So this is estimated canopy height, where darker gray tells us that we probably have taller vegetation in that location. And that's something we didn't have until very recently at our site. It's been around for a while, but we didn't have it. And so what we've done is in my lab, we've gone out and ground truthed vegetation to train a computer to try and find areas that are grass, shrub, tree, or other, so water and roads. And so what we've done is through photo interpretation, but primarily through ground truthing of high precision GPS units, we've developed polygons, which give us about 200,000 pixels to train our computer to try and find these types of vegetation. We held out 30% of our data to evaluate the accuracy of our approach here. And what we did is we used a random forest model, which is kind of a intro level machine learning. And when we do this, we get about a 93% accuracy of telling each 2 by 2 meter pixel if it's grassland, shrub, tree, or something else that's not vegetation. A more simple example, if you've ever been confronted with one of these when you're trying to sign on, you're helping a computer do the same thing. You're telling it which of these appears to be a road. It's using that to train a computer using a more advanced model than we're using. But it's basically a similar concept of using light and other data to train computers to find things we're interested in. And the advantage here is that we can now look at Kanza and its proportional cover of different vegetation types wall to wall, which in general we haven't been able to do. And in fact, doing field work in this type of vegetation is very slow and very onerous because these shrubs are just so thick and many of them are very thorny. So measuring them is actually pretty difficult. So this is an image in red, green, blue. If you've ever been out to Kanza Prairie, you parked your car around here. You can see there's a field here, which we know to be tallgrass prairie, riparian forest, a smattering of trees with an understory of shrubs, a river, and a road, not a road, the hiking trail of tallgrass of Kanza Prairie. So combining these inference of our machine learning and LiDAR, this is how our computer can see them now. Locations shown in green are what the computer estimates to be grassland. Areas in gray are estimated to be tree dominated. Areas in yellow are estimated to be dominated by shrubs, and areas in white are our other category of trails. And then what you can also see in this image is we've used the LiDAR to give you an idea of what the potential texture is. So the 3D structure of this vegetation. So you can see these taller trees over here are casting a deeper shadow. So this kind of gives you just an idea of the 3D structure we can see using these approaches. So another example here, this is an area burned every 20 years. So you can see all these trees interspersed with shrub because we've had long-term fire removal. And you can see over here, we have an area burned every 4 years, and this kind of intermixing of more grassland and shrubby vegetation with some trees dotting along a river here that is a bit harder to make out in this specific image. So before I show you any statistics or anything, I think maps actually tell this story a bit better. This is a map here of a series of watersheds with bison absent. Down here on the bottom right is a watershed that's been burned every year since 1991 or earlier. Right here is a ungrazed area that's burned every 2 years since 1991 or earlier. And if you look at these two images, except along the river areas, it's basically entirely grassland. So if we burn every 1 or 2 years and we have no bison present, we see that we basically maintain a completely grass-dominated system except along rivers. In contrast, this watershed burned up here is burned every 3.5 years on average, and you see a big, big difference. So if we compare an area burned every 2 years to every 3.5 years, this location up here now has 40 to 50% shrub cover. So a really small change in burning led to a really large change in the overall community here. Same thing up here with every 4 years. This is the same kind of image, but with bison present. So this is a location burned every year. Note that this tree vegetation is associated with rivers. This is an area burned every 2 years with bison present over here. And in the middle here is an area burned about every 3.7 years with bison present. And so what I hope jumps out here is that this relationship is much more gradual. We have a little bit of woody vegetation when we burn every year. We have a little bit more when we burn every 2 years. And then we have a bit more when we burn every 4 years. So if you put that all together, and we run it through a statistical model. We use these sub-watersheds that are about every 44 hectares. The relationship in the absence of bison appears to more closely follow what we'd call a threshold model. So if you burn every 1 or 2 years, you see really low shrub coverage. But as soon as we move to every 3 to 4, the amount of shrub cover increases quite a bit. In the presence of bison, this relationship is much more linear. And so if we use approaches like information theory and AIC values, we see in the absence of bison that the AIC value is much lower in the absence of bison, where in contrast, in the presence of bison, the AIC value is much more lower for a linear model. And in fact, actually even the R-squared value of the nonlinear model here in red is even lower. So we don't even have as high a predictive capability, even though our nonlinear model or threshold model has more predictive, more parameters being fed into it. So I'm actually going to zoom through the ground-based approaches because I'm running out of time here, and just kind of talk about what I think this means and then leave some time for questions. So in general, we think of these grasslands as potentially having a set of feedback loops. Grasses can increase the amount of fuel available for fires, which increases fire intensity. More intense fires can kill quite a bit of woody vegetation, especially if those shrubs and trees aren't especially tall. The two species can impact each other through competition. And in fact, in the absence of fire, we know that shrubs and trees are better competitors in our climate than grasses. So in the absence of fire, they will exclude these. So grasses are basically going to need some amount of reoccurring fire, which will allow them to keep killing shrubs and keep maintaining a high intensity fire. And if we keep doing that often enough, in both the absence and presence of grazers, we've shown that this can mostly keep woody plants out of the system. And so where this connects with the theory is that systems with really strong feedbacks can go from having a linear relationship between driver and state to a pretty nonlinear relationship, shown by this this pink color here. So in the absence of a strong feedback, we expect a linear relationship between burning and shrub vegetation. In the absence of a strong feedback, we expect something more like a threshold here. And this again goes back to the 70s. And we've written a simple Locke-Volterra model that shows that we have similar dynamics, we think, in our system as well. Bison do something interesting though, which is that if you burn an area more often, they graze that area more intensely. So they kind of weaken the feedback, and that as you try to burn the system more, they're going to consume more of that vegetation. And each fire you light is going to kill less and less shrubs. This has been shown really nice by E.J. Rayner, using GPS collars on our bison and in other grassland ecosystems as well. So when bison can roam free, they weaken the fire grass feedback because they like to focus their grazing in areas that are burned more often. And so what we think then is that in the presence of bison, the relationship between fire and vegetation, the feedbacks are weaker. And so we see this more linear relationship between disturbance frequency and ecosystem state. In the absence of bison, that grass fire feedback is a really strong nonlinear process. And therefore we get a strong nonlinear relationship between fire frequency and the amount of woody vegetation. So this is kind of a summary of what I just said, but in the absence of bison, we do see, we think, clear statistical evidence of a threshold between fire and the amount of woody vegetation. it seems that as we move from burning every 2 years to about every 3 to 3.5 years, there's a big jump in how much these woody plants can expand. This is potentially catastrophic in a mathematical sense. This has to just do with how we label these. It also does potentially have negative conservation outcomes. In the absence of bison, the relationship appears quite linear. And so what this suggests is that when you remove a key component of this grassland system, it potentially behaves in a more nonlinear way. And whereas when you have the key component present, bison, and acting how it would act, so migrating throughout the land, moving throughout the landscape, the system takes on a more gradual relationship between key drivers and the ecosystem state. So a couple takeaways, I think, from these two studies, these in-progress studies. The removal of large grazers has potentially reduced the average plant diversity of Central Plains grasslands, and I should be less general and say tallgrass prairie. So removing large animals potentially reduces the average plant diversity as you walk around a landscape. The diverse communities that we associate with bison, at least at our site, are resilient to some degree of climate change, perhaps. So, I mean, the most hot, most dry 2-year period did decrease plant diversity for 2 years, but we did see a pretty decent capacity for this system to bounce back. So we didn't see some major shift in the plant community when this climate extreme occurred. And bison have a big impact on the relationship between vegetation and fire, potentially taking a system that's very nonlinear and making it more linear. Some future directions that we're working on in relation to all this. We have one grant submitted to hopefully do experiments in our bison area that get close to that mega drought I'm talking about. So we'd be putting up large drought shelters, 20 by 20 feet in areas with bison, using artificial grazing and these shelters to simulate 5-10-year droughts and see if these plant communities associated with bison will be resilient to the kind of droughts we expect by the end of the century. We have another experiment where we're aggressively reintroducing fire to areas with a lot of woody vegetation and the presence of bison to see if bison impact how we can reverse woody plant expansion. And the overall goal is to eventually use all this data to inform yet more simulation models that can potentially allow us to project into the future and across conditions that our sort of empirical ground-based approaches don't allow us to. So thank you all for your attention. Thanks again, Theo, for the invitation. And I'd really be happy to take any comments or questions anyone might have. Thanks again.
Hey, clappy hand thingy. Excellent. So I'm just going to stop our recording now, and then
Sure.